Imagine growing up in a world where the very people meant to protect you were the ones causing the deepest wounds. In this story, we journey through a life shaped by betrayal, neglect, and buried truths. What happens when the darkness of your past is so vast that it begins to swallow your future? How do you break free from the legacy of silence passed down through generations? This is a story of confronting the monsters hidden within the walls of a family, a journey of breaking cycles and rebuilding from the ashes of shattered trust. Welcome to Fractured Bonds, where every story reveals a deeper truth. The town of Greenridge had a way of disguising its darkness behind picturesque landscapes. To the outside world, it was the perfect place to grow up: small town charm, close-knit community, and quiet streets. But behind closed doors, the tranquility shattered. My grandmother, the one person who seemed untouched by the chaos, had done her best to shield me, but she could only do so much. My mother, with her unpredictable outbursts and erratic behavior, had left scars that no amount of quiet afternoons in my grandmother's garden could heal. One day stands out among the many twisted memories of my childhood. It began innocently enough: the sun streaming through the windows, the smell of my grandmother's lavender soap filling the air. I was playing with my dollhouse, carefully arranging the tiny furniture inside, creating a world I could control. My dollhouse was my sanctuary, the one place where I felt safe, where every piece had its place, unlike the chaos that ruled my life. But then my mother stormed into the room. Her face was flushed, and her eyes wild with anger. I hadn't heard her coming. I was too lost in my little world to notice the warning signs. "What are you doing?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. I froze, my hands still on the tiny chair I was placing at the dining table in my dollhouse. My heart raced, and I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. I knew better than to answer, but silence didn't save me. "You think you can just play all day while I do everything?" Her words were venomous, dripping with contempt. Before I could react, she lunged at the dollhouse, her hands tearing it apart with a ferocity that terrified me. The sound of tiny walls breaking and the doll furniture crashing to the floor felt like my world crumbling. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, watching helplessly as she destroyed the only thing that gave me peace. My stepfather appeared in the doorway, his cold gaze locked on the scene, but he did nothing. He stood there, arms crossed, watching with that same dead expression he always had. It was in that moment I realized something crucial. His silence was not neutrality, it was complicity. His refusal to act was just as violent as her rage. He could have stopped her. He could have protected me, but he didn't. When my mother finally finished her rampage, she stood in the middle of the wreckage, panting, her chest rising and falling with exertion. She turned to me, her face twisted with satisfaction. "Clean this up," she spat before walking out of the room, leaving me to pick up the shattered pieces of my childhood. The transformation of my stepfather from a quiet, somewhat reserved man into a devout member of the church was as sudden as it was unsettling. At first, the change seemed harmless, a newfound commitment to faith, a desire to better himself. But as the months passed, his devotion became an obsession, and the church became more than just a place of worship. It became his stage. Every Sunday, he would sing the loudest, raise his hands the highest, and offer his services for every church function. He became the person people looked to for guidance, advice, and help. But I knew the truth. Behind that facade of righteousness was a man who thrived on control, using his position in the church to mask the darkness that lurked within. The hypocrisy of it all made my stomach churn, especially because I could see how the congregation adored him. They trusted him with their secrets, their children, their lives. But I knew better. I had seen the way his eyes darkened when he was angry, the way his hands gripped the Bible with too much force, as if he were holding back something much more sinister. There was one day in particular that I will never forget. It was after a particularly passionate sermon. He had spoken of forgiveness, of the importance of cleansing ourselves of sin. His voice had boomed through the small church, captivating the audience, and when it was over, people lined up to shake his hand, thanking him for his powerful words. As the crowd thinned, He approached me with that familiar, hollow smile. "Stay behind," he whispered. "We need to pray." I nodded, fear tightening in my chest. I didn't dare defy him, not in front of everyone. The church emptied quickly, and soon it was just the two of us, standing in the dimly lit sanctuary. He led me to the back room, where the walls were lined with dusty books and the air was thick with the scent of old wood. It was a room I had never entered before, a place reserved for only the most devout, or so I had been told. He closed the door behind us, the sound of the latch clicking into place, making my heart race. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. He told me we needed to pray together, to seek forgiveness for my defiance. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something predatory. I knelt beside him as he instructed, bowing my head, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. His voice, once so commanding, now wavered slightly as he began to pray, his hands trembling as they hovered over me. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And then his hands moved, too close, too familiar. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my pulse quickening. I knew I had to get out. I stood abruptly, my chair screeching against the floor, cutting off his whispered prayers. Without a word, I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air, the cold wind biting at my skin. I had escaped, but the fear followed me. It clung to me, reminding me that there was no true sanctuary, not even in the house of God. Family dinners were rare occasions, but when they did happen, they were steeped in an air of forced normalcy. We would sit around the table, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, pretending we were a typical family. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. Every smile was strained, every conversation carefully crafted to avoid the unspoken truths that hung heavy in the air. It was during one of these dinners that the past came rushing back in the most unexpected way. My niece had just been praised for some academic achievement, her cheeks flushed with pride as the rest of the family clapped and cheered. My stepfather, ever the charming patriarch, reached out to pat her shoulder, his smile warm and fatherly. But as his hand lingered, something inside me snapped. I watched, frozen in my seat, as his hand stayed on her shoulder a second too long. My mind raced, flashes of my own childhood rushing to the surface, the way he had touched me, the way his smile had never quite reached his eyes. I looked at my niece, and for the briefest moment, I saw the flicker of discomfort in her eyes, the way her smile faltered ever so slightly. Time seemed to slow. I was no longer at the dinner table. I was a child again, trapped in that house, watching helplessly as my stepfather's hands invaded my personal space, his touch lingering like a dark shadow. The room around me faded, and all I could see was the predator behind the mask. My heart raced, and I wanted to scream, to pull her away from him, but I couldn't move. My body betrayed me, locked in place by the weight of my memories. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in the same room as him, couldn't watch as history threatened to repeat itself. Excusing myself, I stumbled out of the room, my hands shaking as I made my way to the bathroom. I locked the door behind me and leaned against the sink, gasping for breath. The mirror in front of me reflected a pale, wide-eyed version of myself, my chest heaving as I tried to calm down. But I couldn't. Not anymore. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with possibilities. Had he done something to her? Had my silence allowed him to prey on her the same way he had on me? The guilt was overwhelming, and sleep eluded me. I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I had to confront the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. The confrontation with my mother was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. Years of pent-up anger, frustration, and pain boiled to the surface as I sat across from her, my hands trembling with rage. I had rehearsed this conversation 1,000 times in my head, but now that I was face to face with her, the words stuck in my throat. "I know what he did," I finally spat, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. "I know what he did to me, to my niece, and you let him." Her reaction was not what I expected. There was no shock, no denial, just a cold, calculated stare. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest, as if this were just another mundane conversation. "We needed him," she said flatly. "What else was I supposed to do?" Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. I had expected some level of remorse, some acknowledgement of the pain she had allowed into our lives, but there was none. Instead, she justified it, as if the abuse we had endured was a necessary evil, a small price to pay for the life we had. "You stayed with him," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You let him stay in our lives, knowing what he was." My mother shrugged, her indifference chilling. "I did what I had to. You think it was easy? Do you think I had any other options?" Her words cut deep, deeper than any physical blow she had ever dealt. In that moment, I realized that my mother wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was complicit in my suffering. She had chosen him, over and over again, and in doing so, she had abandoned me. I stood, my hands trembling with the weight of everything I had wanted to say. "You had a choice," I said, my voice barely audible. "And you chose him." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out, leaving her in the silence she had created. The door slammed behind me, the sound echoing in the empty house. When my daughter finally told me what had happened to her, the guilt was overwhelming. I had failed her in the same way my mother had failed me. I had allowed the cycle to continue, blinded by my own trauma, too caught up in my past to protect her from the same horrors. Her voice was small, shaking as she recounted what had happened. My stepfather had cornered her during a family reunion, his hands lingering too long on her shoulders, his touch invasive and predatory. She had felt it, the same fear, the same helplessness that I had once felt, and yet she had stayed silent, unsure of how to tell me. "I didn't want to hurt you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to make things worse." Her words shattered me. She had been protecting me, when it should have been the other way around. The guilt was crushing, suffocating, as I realized the extent of my failure. How had I not seen the signs? How had I let this happen again? The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. I marched to my mother's house, my daughter by my side, ready to tear down the walls of silence that had protected him for so long. When I stood before him, the man who had tormented me for years, I felt a rage I had never known before. He sat in his usual armchair, his smug smile still firmly in place, as if he had done nothing wrong, as if he hadn't ruined our lives. "You're done," I spat, my voice shaking with fury. "You'll never touch her again. You'll never hurt anyone again." He tried to deflect, to deny, but I wasn't having it. I laid everything bare, every moment of abuse, every lie he had told, every time he had used his position to manipulate and control. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. It was over. The silence was broken. But the damage had been done, and the road to healing was long and uncertain. Healing wasn't as simple as breaking the silence. The memories still haunted me. The guilt still weighed heavy on my heart. Therapy became my lifeline, but even that felt like reliving the nightmare over and over again. My therapist asked me to create a safe place in my mind, but every time I tried, the shadows of my past crept in, tainting everything I tried to build. The safe place wasn't in my childhood memories, not in the dollhouse or the church, or even in my grandmother's garden. Everywhere felt tainted, corrupted by the trauma I had endured. It wasn't until I stopped trying to escape the pain, and instead sat with it, truly faced it, that I began to heal. The safe place wasn't in the past. It wasn't something I could construct out of memories. It was within me, in my ability to acknowledge the truth, to own my story without shame. Today, my home is filled with light, not because the shadows have disappeared, but because we confront them together. My children know the truth of my past, and I don't hide it from them. Silence allowed the darkness to thrive in my family, but I refuse to let that silence continue. When my children ask me about the past, I tell them, not to burden them with my pain, but to show them the importance of confronting the truth. Secrets fester in the dark, but speaking them out loud is how we take away their power. My legacy will not be one of silence and complicity. It will be one of strength and healing. The past will not define us. It will serve as the foundation on which we build something better. And this time, I'll make sure the walls stay strong. The shadows may always be there, but now, we face them together. With this, the story comes to an end, but the journey doesn't stop here. Thank you for exploring the stories that shape us. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. See you again soon.